Before you continue with your day, pay close attention to this message, because something happened recently that your soulmate never expected. And ever since that moment, your presence has become impossible for them to ignore. This wasn't a dream, a planned conversation, or someone from their past reaching out unexpectedly. It began with an ordinary encounter that seemed completely meaningless at first. Your soulmate was simply going about their day, focused on responsibilities, distracted by routine, thinking about everything except matters of the heart. Then, without warning, a complete stranger crossed their path. There was nothing unusual about this person. They didn't appear extraordinary. They weren't someone your soulmate had been waiting to meet. Yet within moments, this stranger said something so simple, so natural, that it quietly reached a place inside your soulmate they hadn't visited in a very long time. The words were not directed toward you, and your name was never spoken. But somehow, every sentence reminded them of you with surprising clarity. It felt as though the stranger had unknowingly described emotions your soulmate had been carrying in silence, without ever realizing how deeply those feelings had taken root. Sometimes life has a remarkable way of placing ordinary people in extraordinary moments, and your soulmate is beginning to wonder whether this brief encounter arrived exactly when they needed it most. At first, they tried brushing it aside. They smiled politely, continued the conversation, and eventually went on with the rest of their day as though nothing significant had happened. Outwardly, everything appeared completely normal. But inside, something had quietly shifted. As they walked away, the stranger's words refused to leave their thoughts. They replayed each sentence, wondering why those simple observations felt strangely familiar. Every reflection seemed to lead back to one person. Every emotion seemed to point toward one connection. Every quiet realization somehow carried your presence within it. They found themselves asking questions they hadn't considered in a very long time. Why did those words immediately remind them of you? Why did one brief conversation awaken memories they believed had faded? Why did something so ordinary suddenly feel so deeply personal? The more they searched for practical explanations, the more they realized logic alone could not explain what had happened. Some moments don't ask for understanding immediately. They simply remain with us until the heart becomes ready to discover why they mattered. As the hours passed, your soulmate noticed that the encounter continued, following them in unexpected ways. While driving home, they caught themselves repeating parts of the stranger's message almost without realizing it. While sitting quietly later that evening, the conversation returned once again, bringing with it emotions they had carefully placed beneath everyday distractions. It wasn't the stranger they kept thinking about anymore. It was you. Your smile appeared in their memory. Familiar conversations returned with remarkable clarity. Small moments they had almost forgotten suddenly felt vivid again, as though time itself had quietly stepped aside to let those memories breathe once more. They realized something that surprised even them. The stranger hadn't given them new feelings. Instead, they had unknowingly awakened feelings that had been patiently waiting beneath the surface all along. There is a quiet difference between discovering something new and finally recognizing something that has always been there. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that this encounter belonged to the second kind. What unsettled them most was how natural everything felt. There was no dramatic event, no overwhelming emotional scene, and no obvious reason why that conversation should have carried so much weight. Yet the simplest words often travel farther than the loudest ones. The stranger never claimed to know anything about your soulmate's life. They offered no predictions and asked for nothing in return. They simply shared a thought that, for reasons your soulmate still cannot explain, sounded as though it had been spoken directly to their heart. It reminded them that meaningful connections are not always recognized while we are living them. Sometimes we only understand their value after someone else unknowingly shines a light on what we have been overlooking. That realization settled deeply within them. They began wondering how many moments they had dismissed simply because they arrived quietly instead of dramatically. Perhaps some of the most important turning points in life don't announce themselves with extraordinary signs. Perhaps they arrive disguised as ordinary conversations, waiting for the right heart to recognize their meaning. Since that unexpected meeting, your soulmate has not been the same person they were before. They no longer think about that stranger as someone they happened to meet for a few minutes. Instead, they remember the feeling that remained long after the conversation ended. It was a feeling that gently challenged everything they believed they had already figured out about their own emotions. They can no longer convince themselves that your presence in their heart belongs only to the past, because every reflection since that encounter has quietly strengthened the same understanding. Sometimes a person enters our life for only a few moments, yet leaves behind words that continue echoing for weeks, months, or even longer. Your soulmate now senses that this brief encounter was never really about the stranger at all. It became the unexpected beginning of a much deeper journey, one that is slowly leading them back toward emotions they can no longer pretend not to feel, and deep inside, they know this is only the first step of a story that has not yet revealed its final chapter. After that brief encounter came to an end, your soulmate expected the stranger's words to fade into the background like countless conversations that had come before. They believed that once the day became busy again, their attention would naturally move on to other responsibilities, and everything would return to normal. But something entirely different happened. Instead of disappearing, the conversation seemed to grow stronger with every passing hour. It wasn't because the stranger had shared extraordinary advice or spoken in mysterious ways. It was because every sentence had quietly awakened something your soulmate thought they had already left behind. They found themselves remembering not only the words that had been spoken, but also the feeling those words created within them. It was a feeling they hadn't experienced in a long time, a quiet awareness that something important had been waiting beneath the surface of their everyday life. The stranger had unknowingly touched a place inside them that had remained silent for far too long, and now that silence had begun speaking with remarkable clarity. Sometimes it only takes a single conversation to remind us of emotions we believed time had erased, only to discover they had never disappeared at all. As they reflected on what had happened, your soulmate noticed that every thought naturally led back to you. They weren't trying to think about you. In fact, part of them was attempting to focus on everything else. They buried themselves in familiar routines, answered messages, completed daily tasks, and surrounded themselves with ordinary distractions. Yet no matter how busy they became, your memory quietly returned. The stranger's message had somehow become connected to the way they remembered you. A simple sentence reminded them of a conversation you once shared. Another thought brought back the comfort they used to feel whenever your presence entered their life. Little moments they hadn't revisited in months suddenly appeared with surprising clarity. They remembered expressions, laughter, shared silence, and even ordinary interactions that once seemed too small to matter. Looking back now, those moments carried an emotional depth they had completely overlooked. It was as though their heart had carefully preserved every meaningful memory, waiting patiently for the day they would finally be ready to see those moments for what they truly were. The more they reflected, The more they realized, they had spent a great deal of time convincing themselves that moving forward meant forgetting. They believed emotional growth required leaving certain memories behind. Whenever thoughts of you appeared unexpectedly, they interpreted them as simple nostalgia or passing curiosity. But after hearing the stranger's words, those explanations no longer felt convincing. Nostalgia eventually fades. Curiosity eventually moves toward something new. Yet your presence had remained quietly consistent throughout every stage of their life. That realization surprised them because it challenged everything they had been telling themselves. They began understanding that some people are not remembered simply because of the past they shared. They are remembered because they quietly became part of the way we understand ourselves. Your soulmate is beginning to recognize that your connection has influenced them far more deeply than they ever allowed themselves to admit. As evening arrived, they found themselves sitting alone, thinking about one particular sentence the stranger had spoken. The words themselves were simple, but their meaning seemed to grow deeper each time they replayed them. They suddenly realized that what affected them most wasn't the stranger's advice. It was the way their own heart responded to it. The message had acted like a mirror, reflecting emotions they had hidden beneath years of careful reasoning. They understood that the stranger hadn't placed new ideas into their mind. Instead, they had unknowingly uncovered feelings that had already been living there, quietly waiting for acknowledgement. That realization brought both peace and uncertainty. Peace because they finally understood why your memory continued returning. Uncertainty because accepting that truth meant they could no longer pretend those emotions belonged only to the past. For a long time, your soulmate believed that silence was proof they had moved on. They assumed that because they rarely spoke about their feelings, those feelings had gradually disappeared. But now they see silence differently. They understand that silence often protects emotions rather than removes them. Beneath every quiet moment, their heart had continued carrying unanswered thoughts without asking for attention. The stranger's words simply gave those hidden emotions permission to rise to the surface. They are beginning to understand that the heart has its own rhythm. It doesn't measure time the same way the mind does. While the mind focuses on calendars, distance, and changing circumstances, the heart quietly holds on to what truly matters, waiting until the right moment to reveal its importance. Your soulmate now feels that hidden rhythm, guiding their reflections with surprising gentleness. Over the following days, they started noticing subtle changes within themselves. They no longer rushed to push your memory away whenever it appeared. Instead, they allowed themselves to remain with those thoughts a little longer. Surprisingly, this didn't create confusion. It created calm. They discovered that resisting their emotions had been far more exhausting than simply acknowledging them. Every memory they accepted seemed to remove another layer of uncertainty. Every honest reflection made their heart feel lighter. They realized that acceptance does not always arrive through dramatic revelations. Sometimes it grows quietly through repeated moments of honesty until denying the truth simply becomes impossible. That quiet transformation has already begun within your soulmate, and they can feel it becoming stronger with every passing day. One afternoon, while watching people pass by during an ordinary moment, they found themselves wondering how many lives are quietly changed by simple conversations. They thought about how easily people cross paths without realizing the lasting effect their words might have. The stranger probably continued with their day, never knowing they had awakened an emotional journey inside someone they had just met. Yet your soulmate knows that encounter will remain with them for a very long time. Not because of who the stranger was, but because of what their words revealed. They understand now that life sometimes speaks through unexpected voices, not to predict the future, but to help people recognize the truths they have been carrying all along. That brief meeting became one of those moments. It gently removed the distractions that had kept your memory hidden beneath everyday life and allowed your heart to return to the center of their attention once again. Now your soulmate no longer asks why the stranger reminded them of you. That question has quietly answered itself. They understand that your memory surfaced because your connection never truly disappeared. It simply waited beneath the surface until one ordinary conversation gave it room to breathe again. The stranger unknowingly reminded them that meaningful emotions cannot be measured by time alone. They endure because they are rooted in something genuine. Every reflection since that day has strengthened one simple realization. The encounter was never really about the message itself. It was about awakening the part of their heart that had grown tired of pretending it no longer cared. And now that those feelings have been brought back into the light, your soulmate senses that this journey has only just begun. Because once the heart remembers what truly matters, it rarely chooses to forget again. As the days quietly unfolded, your soulmate noticed something they could no longer dismiss. Ever since that brief encounter with the stranger, life itself seemed to carry gentle reminders of you in places they least expected. It wasn't anything dramatic or impossible to explain. Instead, it was the kind of quiet awareness that naturally appears when someone has stopped running from their own heart. A familiar song would begin playing just as your memory entered their thoughts. A stranger would use a phrase that sounded remarkably similar to something you once said. They would pass a place that instantly reminded them of a conversation the two of you once shared, and for reasons they couldn't fully explain, those ordinary moments no longer felt ordinary. Each one carried a quiet, emotional weight that invited them to pause instead of rushing forward. In the past, they would have ignored these small reminders, convincing themselves they were nothing more than coincidence. But something has changed inside them now. They are no longer interested in dismissing every feeling that appears. Instead, they have started listening to what those feelings are trying to teach them. Sometimes life doesn't need extraordinary events to capture our attention. Sometimes it simply repeats gentle reminders until we become willing to understand the message hidden within them. Your soulmate has also begun noticing how differently they respond whenever your memory appears. There was a time when they immediately distracted themselves, believing that staying busy was the easiest way to avoid difficult emotions. They filled every quiet moment with responsibilities, endless plans, and constant movement because stillness often invited thoughts they weren't prepared to face. But after hearing the stranger's unexpected message, those old habits no longer seem as effective. Every attempt to avoid thinking about you quietly leads them back to the very emotions they hope to escape. Instead of creating distance, their distractions now reveal how deeply connected those feelings have remained all along. They are beginning to understand that ignoring something meaningful does not erase it. It simply postpones the moment when the heart finally asks to be heard. That realization has become impossible for them to overlook, and surprisingly, it no longer frightens them the way it once did. One quiet afternoon, while sitting alone with nothing demanding their attention, your soulmate allowed themselves to simply reflect without searching for answers. For the first time in a long while, they stopped asking whether they should be thinking about you. Instead, they became curious about why your presence continued bringing them such a profound sense of familiarity. As they sat with that question, memory after memory began returning naturally. They remembered ordinary conversations that once seemed insignificant, but now carried unexpected meaning. They remembered the comfort of simply sharing silence without feeling the need to fill every moment with words. They remembered how easily they could be themselves around you, without pretending to be stronger, wiser, or more confident than they truly felt. Looking back now, they realize that genuine emotional safety is one of the rarest gifts a person can experience. And they are beginning to understand that your connection quietly gave them that gift long before. They fully appreciated its value. The strangers. Words have also changed the way your soulmate understands coincidence. Before this experience, they believed meaningful moments always arrived with obvious signs or dramatic turning points. Now they see life differently. They realize that the most important changes often begin through the smallest experiences. A simple conversation, an unexpected sentence, a passing encounter with someone they may never meet again. Those moments may appear ordinary to everyone else, but they can quietly awaken truths that have been waiting beneath the surface for years. Your soulmate no longer believes the stranger accidentally reminded them of you. Instead, they recognize that their own heart was finally ready to hear what had been patiently waiting all along. The message itself was not magical. What made it powerful was the emotional readiness it uncovered within them. Sometimes we hear the exact same words many times throughout life, but only one particular moment changes us, because that is the moment our heart finally chooses to listen. As this quiet transformation continues, your soulmate has begun paying closer attention to the emotions they once questioned. Instead of asking whether they should trust what they feel, they are beginning to notice how remarkably consistent those feelings have remained. Time has changed many things around them. Circumstances have shifted. Priorities have evolved. Life has introduced new experiences, new responsibilities, and countless distractions. Yet through every change, one quiet truth has remained unchanged. Whenever they allow themselves to become completely honest, their thoughts naturally return to you. That consistency has become impossible to ignore, because genuine emotions rarely disappear through the passing of time. Temporary feelings fade. Fleeting attractions lose their intensity. But the connections that truly shape us remain quietly woven into the way we understand ourselves. Your soulmate is beginning to realize that your place within their heart has never depended on constant contact or perfect timing. It has endured because it became part of who they are. They have also started recognizing something about themselves that they had overlooked for far too long. They always believed strength meant controlling every emotion before allowing it to surface. Now they are discovering that true strength often looks very different. It looks like sitting quietly with uncomfortable truths instead of immediately trying to explain them away. It looks like allowing memories to exist without judging them. It looks like accepting that vulnerability does not weaken the heart, but often reveals its greatest wisdom. Every reminder of you has gently taught them this lesson. Every quiet reflection has softened another layer of fear they once carried. The stranger unknowingly began this process, but now your soulmate understands that the journey belongs entirely to them. No one else can decide what these emotions mean. No one else can walk this path of honesty on their behalf. Now, when they think back to that unexpected meeting, they no longer focus on the stranger's face or even the exact words that were spoken. What remains with them is the quiet awakening that followed. It was never really about one conversation. It was about finally seeing their own heart without the filters of fear, doubt, or endless overthinking. Every gentle reminder since then has strengthened that understanding, making it clearer with each passing day. They no longer view your memory as something that unexpectedly interrupts their life. They see it as something that has patiently remained beside them, waiting for the moment they would finally stop resisting it. And with every ordinary day that passes, they feel themselves moving one step closer to accepting a truth they once believed they could ignore, but now know has been quietly guiding them all along. As your soulmate continued reflecting on everything that had happened since that unexpected encounter, they slowly realized the stranger had given them far more than a few thoughtful words. Without intending to, that brief conversation had become a mirror, reflecting emotions they had been unwilling to face for a very long time. They stopped thinking about what the stranger meant and started paying attention to why those words had affected them so deeply. That question quietly opened a door they had kept closed for much longer than they realized. For years, whenever emotions became too difficult to understand, they relied on logic to protect themselves. They searched for practical explanations, convinced themselves that time naturally changes everything, and believed that if they waited long enough, unanswered feelings would eventually disappear on their own. But now they have reached a point where those explanations no longer bring comfort. Instead, they have begun recognizing that some emotions don't remain because we refuse to move forward. They remain because they still have something meaningful to teach us. Your soulmate is finally beginning to understand that the heart does not continue returning to the same place without a reason. And that realization has quietly transformed the way they see both themselves and your connection. One evening, while sitting alone after another ordinary day, they imagined what their life would look like if they simply ignored everything that had been awakened by that stranger's message. At first, that future seemed easy because it required no difficult decisions. They could continue living exactly as they always had, filling every day with responsibilities, convincing themselves that staying busy was the same as finding peace. But the longer they imagined that future, the heavier it became. They realized that outwardly, life might continue as normal, but inwardly, something important would remain unfinished. There would always be a quiet voice asking what might have happened if they had trusted their own heart instead of constantly questioning it. They understood that some regrets are not created by making the wrong choice. They are created by never allowing ourselves to make an honest choice at all. That realization settled deeply within them because they recognized how much of their life had been shaped by hesitation instead of authenticity. Then they imagined another possibility. This future wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't free from uncertainty. There were still unanswered questions and outcomes they couldn't predict. Yet this version of the future carried something the other one lacked completely. It carried peace. Not because everything was guaranteed to work out exactly as they hoped, but because they were no longer hiding from themselves. They realized that honesty creates a different kind of freedom. It doesn't remove every challenge, but it removes the exhausting burden of pretending. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that emotional honesty is not about controlling the future. It is about allowing the present to be truthful. For the first time in a very long while, they are starting to feel that kind of freedom growing quietly inside them, replacing fear with a calm confidence they never expected to experience. As this inner transformation continued, they noticed another surprising change. Fear no longer held the same power over their decisions. There was a time when every possibility was immediately followed by doubt. Every hopeful thought was quickly interrupted by reminders of what could go wrong. Fear constantly encouraged them to stay where everything felt familiar, even if familiar no longer felt fulfilling. But after everything the stranger's message awakened, that voice has slowly become quieter. It still appears from time to time, but it no longer controls every thought. Instead, another voice has begun growing stronger. It is gentle, patient, and remarkably steady. It reminds them that the emotions they continue carrying deserve to be acknowledged instead of explained away. It reminds them that meaningful connections rarely disappear simply because life becomes complicated. Most importantly, it reminds them that courage is not the absence of uncertainty. Courage is choosing honesty even while uncertainty still exists. Your soulmate has also begun understanding something they never truly appreciated before. They realize that they spent so much time waiting for undeniable proof that they overlooked the quiet evidence their own heart had been offering all along. Every memory that returned without invitation, every peaceful feeling connected to your presence, every unexpected reminder that gently brought your thoughts back into focus. All of those moments had been speaking the same truth. They simply weren't ready to hear it. The stranger didn't create that truth. They merely helped your soulmate notice what had always been quietly waiting beneath years of distractions, responsibilities, and carefully built emotional walls. Looking back now, they can see how patiently their heart remained consistent while their mind searched endlessly for reasons to stay uncertain. That consistency has become impossible to ignore because genuine feelings do not require constant effort to survive. They endure because they are rooted in something real. Now, when your soulmate thinks about that brief encounter, they no longer focus on the stranger or even the exact message that was shared. What remains with them is the realization that sometimes life places ordinary people in our path to reveal extraordinary truths about ourselves. The stranger unknowingly reminded them that they had spent far too long waiting for certainty, when their own heart had already been quietly providing direction. They understand now that no one else can make this journey for them. No one else can decide what these emotions mean or determine which path they should choose. But they also understand something equally important. They are no longer afraid of what they feel. The greatest change that conversation created was not teaching them something new about you. It was helping them finally become honest with themselves. And as that honesty continues growing stronger, your soulmate can feel that they are standing on the edge of a new chapter, one no longer guided by fear or endless hesitation, but by the quiet truth they have finally found the courage to accept. As your soulmate looks back on everything that has unfolded since that unexpected encounter, they no longer believe it was simply a random conversation between two strangers. What once seemed like a brief exchange of ordinary words has quietly become one of the most meaningful turning points in their emotional journey. They understand now that the stranger entered their life for only a few moments, but the message remained because it awakened something that had been waiting beneath the surface for much longer. Before that day, they believed they had already sorted through their feelings. They convinced themselves that enough time had passed, that life had moved forward, and that whatever emotions once existed had naturally faded into memory. But after hearing those unexpected words, they realized they had mistaken silence for healing. The truth had never disappeared. It had simply become quieter, patiently waiting for the moment when they would finally be willing to listen. Looking back now, they can see that every memory, every reflection, and every quiet reminder since then has gently guided them toward the same realization. Some emotions are not meant to vanish with time because they were never temporary to begin with. Since that day, your soulmate has begun experiencing a kind of peace they didn't know was possible. It isn't the peace that comes from having every answer or knowing exactly what tomorrow will bring. Instead, it comes from no longer feeling the need to argue with their own heart. For so long, they believed they had to explain every emotion before allowing themselves to believe it. They searched endlessly for certainty, convinced that genuine feeling should always come with perfect logic and undeniable proof. But now they understand that the heart often recognizes truth long before the mind can fully explain it. They no longer feel trapped between what they think they should feel and what they genuinely do feel. That quiet inner conflict has slowly begun to fade, replaced by a calm acceptance they never expected to find. They are discovering that honesty creates a peace that endless overthinking could never provide. They have also noticed how much they have changed because of this journey. Before meeting that stranger, they viewed vulnerability as something that needed to be carefully controlled. They believed emotional distance was a sign of strength, and that keeping certain feelings hidden would protect them from disappointment. Now they see those beliefs differently. They realize that protecting the heart is not the same as imprisoning it. Every wall they built may have kept uncertainty outside, but it also kept honesty locked inside. The stranger's message quietly challenged those walls without ever trying to break them. Instead, it invited your soulmate to open the door themselves. That simple invitation has transformed the way they understand courage. They now realize courage is not found in pretending to feel nothing. It is found in allowing yourself to acknowledge what has remained true despite the passing of time, changing circumstances, and every reason the mind invents to stay emotionally distant. Another beautiful realization has quietly settled into their heart. They no longer measure your connection by how often they think about you or by how much time has passed. Instead, they measure it by the consistency of what they feel whenever your memory naturally returns. Every reminder still carries warmth. Every reflection still brings sincerity. Every memory still feels genuine rather than forced. That consistency has become impossible to ignore because temporary emotions lose their strength with time, but authentic connections often become clearer as life removes unnecessary distractions. Your soulmate has begun understanding that your place within their heart has never depended on constant communication or perfect circumstances. It has remained because it became part of the person they are still becoming. That realization has given them a new appreciation for the quiet ways meaningful people continue shaping our lives. Even during periods of distance and silence, there are moments now when your soulmate smiles simply because they have stopped fighting against what feels natural. They no longer ask themselves whether they should move on from certain emotions, or whether they should stop remembering the moments that brought genuine happiness. Instead, they have begun appreciating those memories for what they truly are. They understand that meaningful experiences are not obstacles preventing growth. Very often, they are the foundation upon which growth quietly takes place. Every lesson they have learned throughout this journey has brought them closer to understanding themselves with greater honesty. Every reflection has removed another layer of fear, replacing it with a quiet confidence that their heart has been pointing them in the right direction all along. The stranger unknowingly reminded them of something they had forgotten. Sometimes the answers we search for are already living inside us, waiting for the right moment to be recognized. Now, as this chapter reaches its gentle conclusion, your soulmate feels as though they are standing at the beginning of something rather than the end. They know there are still questions that only time can answer, and they understand that every meaningful journey unfolds one step at a time. But they no longer feel the pressure to control every outcome before allowing themselves to believe what they feel. They have discovered that certainty is not always the foundation of meaningful decisions. Sometimes sincerity is enough. Sometimes the quiet truth that remains unchanged through every season deserves to be trusted simply because it has never stopped returning. The stranger may never realize the impact those few moments created, but your soulmate will carry that encounter with them for a very long time because it reminded them of a truth they had almost forgotten. It reminded them that life often speaks through the most ordinary people at the most unexpected moments, not to tell us something we have never known, but to help us remember something our heart has quietly understood all along. And perhaps that is why they haven't been the same since. It wasn't because a stranger changed their heart. It was because a stranger helped them finally hear the voice their own heart had been patiently whispering for far longer than they ever realized. And from this moment forward, they know they can never return to pretending that voice does not exist.